So Stupidity Paradox on functional stupidity in organizations. And having written about 40 books, I think, and hundreds of articles, I probably would say that this is my greatest contribution to mankind, if I've ever made such a contribution. But if this comes closest. And this is part of my stupidity trilogy. So the first book was actually this one, Triumph of Emptiness, about the grandiosity of our time. And then the second with Andre Spicer that I will talk about now is then this Stupidity Paradox, the power and pitfalls of functional stupidity at work. And there's a third one so far only published in Swedish, which explains everything. It's called More of Everything, Extra Everything. This is a picture of organization. Of course, it's not the only possible image, but it illustrates some of the inclinations that sometimes may take place in organizations full of well-paid, intelligent or smart people, and they are very busy doing things. You can see under the nice, perhaps, organizational surface, a lot of peculiar things are going on. Celebration of something, somebody has done something, people are confused, busy, not particularly reflexive about what they are doing. So this is one image one could consider. Another one is this one here, that we often like to think use and are quite independent and autonomous and reflexive and so on, then we walk intellectual capacities that tend to disappear. So you may be very focused on doing the job, but often a lot of the kind of reflections or the reference points that we normally would be using in our lives, it tends to disappear because we are so disciplined and sometimes stupidified by organizational expectations and our taking of roles in the workplace. So, of course, there are sometimes some countermeasures to this. One should ask stupid, unexpected questions or think a bit differently about issues. So sometimes that is celebrated, but often there is a strong mainstreaming, adapt, being compliant effect that tend to dominate people. And this is something I think that a lot of images. At the same time, we have a very strong domination, even hegemonic impact of a smartness paradigm, where we are supposed to be very knowledgeable and intelligent and so on. But we all know that organizations are full of stupidities. Slogans, practices, rules, rituals, etc., etc. And then, well, these are deviations from the ideal. The ideal of being rational and smart, and sometimes we have stupidities, but these are deviations. But perhaps not. Perhaps organizations in key respects are fundamentally stupid, is a question that one could raise. And perhaps stupidity is not only a liability, a disadvantage, but something that actually makes organizations work in many ways. That's the question that we, Andre Spicer and I asked, and we started this by writing a paper in Journal of Management Studies. Now people are ruining my comfort here, but we give them 2 minutes and I continue, and hopefully, can you hear me? Can you hear me? Yes. So the kids from the school, they normally move away after a minute or so. So we started by writing a paper in Journal of Management Studies, 2012, a stupidity-based theory of the organization. And after published that, world media became very interested. So a lot of newspapers around the world, largest newspapers in India and Italy and Guardian, I think, and others in UK and so on, they were very interested in this. And people thought it was an interesting thought. And this goes a bit against then the normal idea that knowledge and intelligence rules. And we have enormous amount of talk and references to knowledge society, knowledge economy, knowledge intensive firms, etc., etc. And of course, this captures some key elements of what's happening in organizations. But often you have at the same time knowledge, competence, and stupidity, because you can be very knowledgeable within a narrow domain as a true expert. And with a rigorous and very precise and over-specialized expert, you often find stupidity outside that narrow terrain. So often when we cultivate knowledge, specialized knowledge, then we also indirectly cultivate stupidity. So it's not so that we have knowledge or stupidity. Often we have knowledge and stupidity intertwined in different ways. And of course, a lot of people that are experts, they're very inclined then to use the expertise. What is the problem? I have the solution. Maybe often a success formula for a lot of people, because you're very convincing as an expert, as a consultant, if you can very strictly then narrow the agenda and people buy into the agenda, and then you push for the solution and the status and privileges that may follow from that for you as the expert. So this is one element here. And one can ask, does all this mushrooming of higher education, does it really create people that make us smarter in the kind of more broader sense, not only smart in this sense, but also a bit more intelligent and thoughtful and reflective and good at using our small grey cells, as Hercule Poirot, the famous Belgian, not French, detective would put it. Can you still hear me, by the way?
Yes, we can hear you.
It's okay, so
yes,
yeah, no complaints. There is an enormous amount of talk about us being so well educated and us so knowledgeable and intelligent and so on, but I think that a lot of this is fake. This is what I claim in the Triumph of Emptiness book, that we have enormous expansion of higher education, but that doesn't necessarily put any particular effect on people. So there's an American study called Academically Adrift, and they try to test if students, college and university students, necessarily benefit from their studies in terms of generic cognitive skills. And their finding was that 40% they didn't improve at all when they had a test before they started their education and when they finished the program. So they were as intelligent or as stupid as when they started. There were no measurable effect. And I do think that a lot of contemporary higher education, it doesn't really stick. It has no intellectually improving effects at all. And it's not just my idea, but this is clearly shown by Aram and Rockstar in this book published by University of Chicago Press 2011. So a lot of all this kind of hype around knowledge and competence and intelligence and other things that tend to be a bit misleading. So in this series here, the Cranfield sponsored series of talks, I talked about methodology, and one aspect around methodology useful for creating interesting research questions and interesting research ideas. I was then recommended, people to do assumption challenging. So you look at what are the dominant assumptions taken for granted, and then you see if you can check them and come up with counter assumptions or alternative assumptions that make sense and can lead to more interesting research routes. And in this case, Andres Spicer and we moved then from the conventional question, how do firms use their knowledge base, to how do organizations cultivate and use their stupidity base. And that may actually be called for all these university teachers with good mood doing higher education that leads to nothing in terms of progress, in terms of the cognitive abilities of the students. So universities that call perhaps for some degree of stupidity for people to happily doing their lecturing without this necessarily leading to so much. Just a brief illustration. When we talk about stupidity here in the book and in the article that I mentioned, then it's important to recognize we are not talking about pure stupidity. We are not talking about people with low IQ, people that lack competence, that are totally misplaced at the workplace. So it's not that we have this like obvious level of incompetence or stupidity. That is not what we are referring to. We are not referring to the Homer effect, the stupid worker, or the idiotic leader like in The Office. If you've seen that television series, particularly the UK one, I think it's excellent. The US is a bit like that. But it illustrates how a manager can really buy into a lot of simple kind of truths or formulas for how to do management or leadership, and it becomes sort of ridiculous and people embarrassing to watch, but extremely funny as well. We're not talking about the bureaucratic stupidity like Eichmann, where you follow totally crazy orders and just follow them without anything. So we're not interested in this easily identifiable, obviously dysfunctional or stupidity. We are interested in forms of stupidity that are not recognized as stupidity or not easily recognized as stupidity. So things that are outcomes of stupidity that creates obvious irritation and obvious problems. That is not what we address. So pure stupidity may be a problem in organizations, but it's normally a minor problem because it's recognized and it can be dealt with. So supervisors and colleagues and so on, they deal with this, and the bureaucracy tends to avoid then pure stupidity leading to disasters. Of course, there are exceptions, but this is quite common. What we are interested in is more normalized stupidity, institutionalized, socially supported stupidity, which is, as we see it, a central aspect of how organizations often function, particular large organizations, and particular organizations where there is no clear feedback, in the sense that here you can see the outcomes, like in a sports team, where you can see that you are losing the games or you are progressing in Champions League or whatever. But a lot of organizations or parts of organizations, it's not so clear exactly what you are accomplishing, and the results, they're always highly ambiguous, and they can't refer back or be related back to what the HR department are doing, or branding or advertising campaign may lead to or not lead to, or whatever. So and I would claim that it's functional stupidity. It's very important, perhaps as important or more important than knowledge in the functioning and thriving of organizations. So and this is a matter of denial of complexity and ambiguity of the world. And it's partly a moral issue. So our argument here is very much that we have an obligation to think, even if it's easiest then to walk into the office or doing research where you accept then box thinking and the formula for how to do research and getting published and so on. I think that's clearly not good enough. We have, at least in the free countries, democratic countries, a moral obligation to think as far as we can and then take some responsibility for our actions following that kind of thinking. And the sad thing is that it's not what most people do at work. according to my 30 years of in-depth organization studies. I think it's astonishing how thoughtless a lot of people are. And this leads then to functional stupidity. It's one way of accounting for this, to describing it and accounting for this. So we see it as the inability and or unwillingness to use the cognitive and reflective capacities in anything other than narrow and circumspect ways. So you may use your abilities within the job description boundaries. But what comes before, what comes after, how our senior people or other levels of the organization, how they are kind of functioning in relationship to this, if it all makes sense. That's kind of outside then the picture. I do my thing as a corporate lawyer, as an HR person, as a sales manager, engineer, maintenance expert, diversity management developer, whatever. I do my things like this. And this is what contemporary organizations tend to be good at doing, emphasizing and cultivating a high level of specialization and also narrow-mindedness. And then people that tend to buy into and adapt to a lot of the constraints following this. So there's an unwillingness or inability to ask questions such, what are we doing here? What are we accomplishing? What does this lead to? Why should we do this? Or what in hell are we doing here? Why we are sitting at these meetings? Why are we struggling with this vision? While we're filling in these forms, have experiences, developing your team skills or leadership capacity or whatever. So in that sense, we suggest that organizations, they can be seen as generators of functional stupidity. So that's our metaphor for organization. And of course, with all metaphors, they are partial. They don't claim to capture the entire truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth to help you, God, or some other authority. The idea here is then that we point at something that we find is very important to point at and encourage people to think in slightly different ways than the more conventional ones when it comes to these issues. So functional stupidity, it means that there is a shortage of reflexivity, at least outside then the box. The box that can be job description, rules, legislation, top management orders, a fashion that you may kind of jump on or whatever. There's a lot of boxes providing constraints for what is easy to think about. So lack of reflexivity, lack of substantive reasoning, where you're not thinking about the means and optimizing the means, but thinking about what does this lead to? What are the implications? What are the value creating effects of all this? For example, in teaching, then, does this lead to these kids are not just passing the course or filling in a formula where they say they are happy with education, but does it lead to them becoming more thoughtful people, more capable of being autonomous and ethically grounded in their lives afterwards? These kind of questions. No. That's kind of complicated. We just concentrate on doing what we are told and optimizing means. Functional stupidity means that we are not asking for justification either. You are told this, the boss has instructed you, people used to do this, others do like this, etc., and then that's no good reason. Functional stupidity means that you don't ask for justification. You just accept what you are expected to do without asking, why should we do this? What's the reasoning, the motives for doing this? So one use intellectual resources only in a rather narrow and safe terrain, not outside that. And going outside your job description, your profession, the vision being stated, the policy or whatever, that is always a bit risky. It calls for some more thinking. It calls some kind of moral commitment to things. And of course, the advantage with all this functional stupidity in organizations is that it allows or facilitates organizations to function smoothly. It saves the organizations from a lot of frictions and problems and conflicts, people feeling it stressful or running into difficulties. So functional stupidity is very good in terms of maintaining organizational order. It's like a lubricator for organizational life. I mean, just imagine the situation. You sit there as a manager and you have bought into the corporate policy and you explain that to all people and find that that's fine because you haven't thought of it more than that top management has decided. And then somebody is saying, why should we do this? What's the reasoning behind this? What in hell is this about? Even if, in particular, if it's a well-grounded question or comment, then that's not what you like to hear as a kind of loyal, compliant, middle-level manager. It's very embarrassing, and it may undermine your authority and create a lot of social unrest and conflict at the workplace. So normally as a manager, you like people that has a talent for functional stupidity. This can also be motivating. So I do my work here and then I do it very diligently because I assume it's part of a rational order and it's very useful for whatever purpose. If you should start to think carefully about this, then it may be demotivating. A lot of work is quite questionable, even meaningless in contemporary work life. And that is not necessarily then particularly motivating if you start to think about these issues. So, drivers of functional stupidity. There are different drivers behind all this that you may have not any ideas or any frameworks for thinking outside the box. You may be cognitively locked into a particular narrow paradigm or bureaucratic structure or organizational culture, whatever. So there's no reference point outside this. So if you've lived in a particular environment all your life and people that you interact with, they tend to belong to the same tribe as you. You've been a school teacher your entire life, and before that you were a pupil in the school and so on, then you may be a bit functionally stupid because you have no access to other worlds, other reference points than the school system. And if you are a career researcher, then only sending out questionnaires to people and have very little contact with organizations or other settings than academics and so on, then you may also lack ideas outside your limited intellectual terrain. You may also have low motivation or be lazy. You don't like to think that much. And why should I think differently? Thinking too much can only cause problems. Maybe your slogan. Or you are very eager to socially fit in. You lack flock immunity. And I'm not talking about COVID here. I'm talking about this inclination to agree with people around us, which is very strong often. We are social animals and we like to make friends with people and we don't like to be deviates. And then there may be anxieties. If I start to think, then what will happen then? I may run into problems. I may be wrong. If you have low self-esteem and are a bit anxious as a person, then it may be very safe then to be cultivating functional stupidity. And sometimes people are very loyal. I'm very loyal to my profession or occupation, to my organization or my unit or whatever group that you are belonging to. And then institutional loyalty makes it difficult then to think differently about issues. So all these are drivers into functional stupidity, and they're often very powerful forces. Then, of course, you have the counter forces, drivers out of functional stupidity. If you are an intellectual person that is read rather broadly, you have access to different reference points, read about different thinkers, etc., then that may be a driver outside this. If you have a sharp intellect, so you can see through all the kind of bullshit and dark side of bureaucracies and so on, then you may also be inclined to move out of functional stupidity. If you have an interest in something, you start to become curious. How come? What's happening now? Like to assess what goes on here and what are the outcomes of all this. You may have self-confidence. So you really feel that I know, trust my judgment. I don't have to rely on other people's judgment to make my assessment. You think that's a moral duty. I have a moral duty to think for myself and to take some responsibility more than tick off all the boxes. And sometimes we are not that strongly identifying with our organizations or our units or our professions. And with lower level of identification, then we are a bit more free in terms of the identity implications of how we see ourselves. So this may be drivers out of functional stupidity. For many people in many situations, the drivers into this are stronger than the others. But we always have some tension around these various inclinations or orientations. What to say, of course, but if there are any questions or comments, we could open up for this. There is a chat function here, but I'm a bit stupid myself. I'm functionally stupid. I concentrate on my talk and I don't look at the chat function because then I may be a bit lost. But
yeah, there are a couple of interesting questions in the chat so far. So one is related to the knowledge management. So considering this stupidity paradigm, is knowledge management still relevant those days in order to improve organizational performance? Is it relevant, and how knowledge management can be used with the stupidity concept? What do you think?
Yeah, and I think it's an interesting question. So, I mean, knowledge management can probably be used in different ways. So sometimes you have the idea that here is like the solution, and then you use that and you basically copy that, which means that you may do something that is good, but you may also fall for the trap of imitating others, which can be problematic if it's not done very carefully and critically. So in that sense, I mean, it can lead to that people stop thinking too much and just take examples of possible solutions that may have worked or may have not worked at other places, and then you try to insert that, which always is a slightly risky thing, but why not? So in that sense, it's may reinforce stupidity at work. Then, of course, you can probably have other examples, and you can use knowledge management in order to create contacts. And then if you have time, you engage in dialogues with people with experiences and so on. So I don't think that there are different forms of knowledge management and different ways of approaching this. I mean, one extreme is knowledge management. Here is available packages. You use them, and sometimes that's productive and good, and sometimes it's not. So it may be in line with stupidity stuff or not. In other cases, it's more a matter of connecting people that could engage in creative dialogues. And in that case, it probably is a bit opposite of then what the stupidity management idea here would suggest. So it depends very much of what's happening in these uses of knowledge management, I would say.
Thank you, Mats. Another interesting question. Stupidity is really subjective and evocative term. Is there another one? And I think it's important because we are pretty much prepared to allocate this term to someone else, all right? But what about self-awareness? It is difficult to recognize stupidity in ourselves. So do you have a milder word for this?
Yeah, well, I mean, you could say low reflexivity or I mean, there's a lot of variation here. Then one could use alternative terms instead. I like the term stupidity, and because it tends to be a bit provocative, and particularly the concept here, functional stupidity. I think that there's an advantage because functional means it works. There are clear functions and positive effects. Stupidity is the opposite. And I do think if you have like a strong statement like this, it may be a bit insulting and provocative for most people, but the jury actually has decided this is an excellent concept. At least it was 1 year after we published the first article in Journal of Management Studies, 2012. It was included in official Swedish language, together with 39 other new concepts. The only one that I do remember is selfie, that also was incorporated in official Swedish language 2013. And some people said, well, selfie is much more common that we take selfies than we engage in functional stupidity. No, functional stupidity is much more common. Even the most committed selfie photographer can't compete with the average employee into functional stupidity at a large public bureaucracy, for example, and a large company as well. But of course, one can come up with alternative terms if one believes or feels, or in relationship to one's boss or colleagues or other people, where one wants to create some interest for something like this. So I like the term, and was interviewed by one journalist and says this is a cult term in Sweden. So I feel that a lot of people, they actually find this valuable. But I know that some people are offended by this as well. But it's important to say that functional stupidity calls for competence, and it calls for some level of intelligence. You need to be relatively competent and relatively intelligent to be functionally stupid. Quite different from being purely stupid.
We have some more questions in the chat, but I would suggest we carry on, and then we will kick off the Q&A session with the questions from the chat.
Okay. I think there's a raised hand. Maybe Alicia could ask a question.
Yes, thank you. I'm just wondering, like, if I understand well, you say we all have a functional stupidity, but we use it in different ways?
Yeah, I mean, most of us, all of us, we are functionally stupid sometimes. I mean, we may eat meat, we may be against cruelty to animals, and we may be against environmental pollution, and then we eat meat without necessarily thinking too much about this, and become insulted if somebody is saying that we actually did eat part of a previously live body. So that's just an example. I mean, some people, they don't mind, but a lot of people, they feel that they don't like to think like that at all, really. So most of us are functionally stupid part of the time. And this is for these reasons that I mentioned before. It makes us fit into the situation and so on. Then, of course, we have moments where we are really reflexive and think about issues and so on. So most of us tend to go between different types of situations and issues where we are more or less functionally stupid and more or less like the opposite. So, yeah.
Thank you.
So should we move on then and have more Q&As a bit later, if that's okay with the audience here? So in organizations, then we have different moods of stupidity: drivers, outcomes, inducers of all this, and of course structure, formal structure with division of labor, hierarchies, and other elements. One, leadership is often a source of this action. They need to be very action-minded, appear to be on the move all the time, make things happen, do it, etc. Institutions may be an important source in organizational cultures. They often function as psychic prisons, as blinders, or blinkers, perhaps is the right word. Yeah, blinkers, probably, yeah. So, and then very briefly then, I give a couple of empirical examples. In the book, then we have the example of Pepsi executives, and we take this example from John Scully. John Scully, he was vice president at Pepsi, and then he was recruited to Apple as the new president by Steve Jobs. And then he describes in his memoirs, we actually tried to rationalize his firing of Steve Jobs. So, but he describes then with the title Boot Camp, Executive Meetings at Pepsi. And then it's described as very hierarchical, very competitive, very masculine. Everybody's very much into the cola wars, Coca-Cola versus Pepsi-Cola. And this was framed like a warlike situation with the enemy. And then differences between the companies, they were highlighted in different ways, and very fierce competition between the companies, but also fierce about improving their numbers, sales and growth and profits and so on. And they had executive meetings where all the numbers were carefully then scrutinized, and everybody saw this is like a fair situation and no excuses or anything. And then very intensive questioning and kind of sharp climate. But nobody was kind of objecting or complaining. Nobody ever thought about removing the jackets, irrespective of how stressful the situation became. And everybody was prepared to improve their numbers so they could move up on the table closer to the position of the chairperson, who was clearly the center of all attention. And then people were sitting here in a hierarchical order. They arrived to the meetings also in hierarchical orders. So hierarchy and competition and promotion important here. And then they describe themselves as extremely the gym frequently, and really training their bodies and training their minds, so that they belong to the Marine Corps of the business world, engaged in the cola wars. And this was profitable, so people were actually doing quite a lot of work, and then Pepsi-Cola improved in terms of their position in relationship to Coca-Cola and so on. So it was like a success story. But all this very much dependent on functional stupidity, because to buy into these notions of what's valuable and important and what's the meaning of life and how am I and what is the nature of our business and so on, you need to stop thinking too broadly and need to buy into these constructions of the nature of competition. It's not like war. There are no casualties. It's not that bloody seriously recently, but it became for them because they bought into this war imaginary, and then seeing themselves as the Marine Corps of the business world. I mean, come on, what are these people doing? They're selling sweetened water they're sitting there and deciding about price setting and commercial campaigns and things like that. So Marine Corps of the business world. If you move outside that kind of narrow, functionally stupid framework, then it becomes a bit ridiculous. But it was stupid, but it was also functional because people were very motivated and hardworking and performance oriented. So Scully, he described that when he had assistants, he kind of fired them quickly if they were not good enough. So not so many kind of complicating considerations, but only performance maximization as the logic. So I say that this is a good example how functional stupidity sometimes pays off. And there are other cases that are a bit more mixed. So I remember one day I had with HR managers in a large Swedish municipality. There were 20 of them present. One of these 20 had moved from being an HR manager to being an operational manager. And then she discovered all the steering documents, the policy and management control mechanism that her previous peers and others, they have developed in order to improve then the organization. And she then discovered all this. And she said, now I've discovered how many steering documents we have developed and we are expected to comply with in this this organization. And then she said, well, friends, we need to change the way we are thinking. And here you can say that you probably heard a voice of reason. Guess what happened then? Total silence. Nobody was kind of reacting in any way whatsoever. And I brought this topic up in the end of the day, and then here you got some good feedback. Shouldn't you really reconsider what you're doing and try to improve things? And they looked as stupid as before. And nobody said one word. So people are often caught in that kind of improvement of work environment issues or quality control or regulations for the use of cars or traveling or blah, 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 blah. And then you have this endless amount of stuff supposed to improve things. Yeah. So we have extremely many examples. So in the book, we try to show that this is not just our invention, but endless examples. And most people with some experience and some ability to think more broadly, they probably can see that organizations are full of this. In some cases, we may see them, but there may be a good reason behind a particular formal thing, but still, in many cases, it's example of narrow-mindedness. So the stupidity part is more significant than the functional part. Anyway, we have structurally induced stupidity. I just mentioned that. And we have leadership-induced stupidity. The idea of leadership is that you should have followers. Leadership implies followership. Followership implies that you tend to think a bit less broadly about issues. You tend to be very responsive to what the manager, the leader, say. So in that sense, leadership cultivates functional stupidity. Even if it's like good leadership, it's still kind of dependence and looking up to the leader that tends to become a bit enlarged compared to one's colleagues. You have the like enlargement of the leader, and then you have some small doing of other people. So in that relationship, it calls for asymmetry. And you may have collegial relationships and somebody becomes the leader, the boss, and then you tend to think a bit less independently in relationship to that person. And this can be good. It can be very functional in many situations, but it's still an example where functional stupidity may be cultivated. You may have action-induced stupidity, just do it, make decisions quickly and so on. you have a lot of these elements. Institutions, these are the habits, these are the solutions. Everybody else, they have strategies and policies and HRM, endless amount of HRM and CSR and knowledge management and budgeting and weekly meetings and appraisal talks and so on. And some of this may make sense sometimes, but often, well, why are you doing this? Why are you having this? Well, because everybody else. Is it motivated in this case? Well, I don't know, but everybody else is having this. We should have that as well. So, institutions that tend to induce stupidity because we like to imitate and we like to do things that look good and are worried about getting critique for not having all the right structures and policies and window dressing arrangements in place. So a lot of time in organization is spent doing stupidity management, and then we respond here by self-stupidity management. We stupidify ourselves. We make work life a bit easier and less friction-oriented. And I mentioned then before various drivers, but I can add here that authority is or anxiety for sanctions may drive all this, but often we are seduced. We like to have it comfortable and then to be persuaded. This is probably okay, this is fine, my boss knows the best things, policymakers, they are brilliant, probably this looks really good, whatever. So we tend to do this. And then we look at others and what others do and they seem to like, we tend to follow because we are often quite conformist. Of course, we're all true and unique individuals, as Monty Python put it. You know, you've seen Monty Python, Life of Brian. There's one episode where Brian, he's then followed by a large number of followers. Brian is then mistaken for Jesus. So people think that it's Jesus, the savior, and they follow him to hear his words. And Brian is not really a leaded person, so he likes to be left alone. And then encourage people to not follow. So he says to them, you are born with one mouth. Yes, we are all unique individuals. And then you hear one voice, I'm not. And I think it's a brilliant capturing then of how we normally function and how we see ourselves. And one explanation for functional stupidity that a lot of social psychologists experiments, Milgram and Ash and others, they have shown this quite clearly. So we are inclined to follow, imitate others. The vision sounds so seductive and so authoritative, and we need to have a vision. I need to have a vision to know what to do at work and so on. Then sad, but so. Well, and we can discuss this endlessly. Of course, I should not talk too much. Just remind you, this is a mixed blessing. It creates social order. It creates smoothness at workplaces. It's a lubricant. It leads to people being compliant and disciplined, which is good. Organizations call for this. It leads to reduction of doubt, because otherwise it can be quite stressful, and you can be quite cynical and doubt why are we doing this? What is this all about? Actually, that was the way through which Jobs persuaded then Scully at Pepsi to change jobs. At that time, Apple was a much smaller company, so it was not an obvious career move by Scully. But then Jobs, he said to Scully, do you intend to sell sweetened water the rest of your life, or do you like to come with me and change the world? And of course, that created some new thinking then, and kind of captured the attention of Scully. Functional stupidity is also good because it can lead to focused behavior. people can be very committed, very focused, because they are liberated of all this kind of doubt and decision anxiety that otherwise may characterize them at work. So these are the good things with functional stupidity. So we have the functional part of stupidity, but then we have the stupid part of functional stupidity, and that tends to often go very close to each other. So it's not easy to, well, we just remove the stupidity part and we retain the functional part. Not easy. But then the stupidity part of functional stupidity is that bad practices and systems are often left unquestioned. So people may follow a route even if it's the stupid or wrong one. It easily leads to an economy of meaningless tasks. So sooner or later, people may discover why all this form filling, why all these exercises with employer branding and visions and policy writing and appraisal talks or whatever. They are not necessarily all the time meaningless, but sometimes they may be. And individuals limit their choices to become caught in narrow career logic or adaptive logic rather than to be more autonomous and go for more freedom choices. And sometimes, of course, functional stupidity may lead to disasters, or at least very bad contributions. So sometimes companies, they can go up due to functional stupidity, but they can also go down if there are no countermeasures and if this is kind of pushed too far. So it's typically a mixed blessing. And as I said before, you need to be relatively intelligent to be functionally stupid, relatively competent. Otherwise, and there are two opposites to functional stupidity, probably many, but two that I like to highlight. One is then pure stupidity. We are technically incompetent. You do wrong things, errors. People see this and it creates an obvious, direct mess. That's like pure stupidity, underperformance. But then you have another opposite of functional stupidity, and that is dysfunctional reflexivity. It's a bit like Hamlet. The Hamlet dilemma, to be or not to be. You become a bit stuck in careful reflection about what to do and how to relate to things. So sometimes it can be quite dysfunctional. And some academic environments, they may be characterized by this. And if one would ask my superiors if I had any, they probably would say that I'm into dysfunctional reflexivity. It creates just problems and difficulties, so shouldn't do that much. So a few words about what we can do about this. I mean, sometimes consultants, and of course, sometimes we probably should increase functional stupidity because there are too much people that are stressed and experience existential doubts, and there are conflicts and difficulties and debates and so on. So sometimes we should try to increase functional stupidity because the functional element, the lubrication part, it's underutilized. So sometimes but in most cases, organizations, they are suffering from too much of this. So there is a surplus, an affluence of functional stupidity. And what you do then? Well, sometimes one can work with consultants. They tend to be a mixed blessing because sometimes consultants are themselves so much into functional stupidity. What is the problem? I have the solution. Maybe a template or a success formula of a convincing, persuasive consultant. So consultants can work in both ways. But if you have a good consultant and say, this is one-time event, we like to hear a lot of things that you haven't thought about before. We will never employ you again, not for 5 years at least. So please don't be too diplomatic or cautious. Just give us your honest, sharp opinion about how this company is functioning, without expecting any further purchasing of your services and so on. Then they may be worthwhile perhaps to use. You can have a task force, a cleaning up patrol. So we need cleaners in organizations, and normally it's in order to take care of the dirt and make stuff then physically clean. But we need also cleaning up patrols then to just get rid of a lot of the waste, the crap, all the stuff that just should go out of the door. Routines, practices, systems, standards, arrangements, people with particular kind of expertise that keep themselves and others occupied with rather meaningless tasks and so on. And then you can form task forces and go through Cranfield University example. And then ask people, I mean, you can perhaps anonymously come up with suggestions, we should get rid of this. We are prepared to teach another 20 hours per year if we can get rid of this over documentation, following a lot of procedures, getting rid of some committees, shortening meeting time, whatever. You can use newcomers, people that come there or people that quit it, do systematic interviews anonymously. Tell us about all the peculiar things that you've experienced at this workplace. After a year, people are probably as stupid as others being there for some time. People that quit may do so partly because they have discovered certain things that they find irritating or frustrating. So sometimes one can use newcomers and people that are quitting as informants that are a bit more reliable than people that hang around forever and so on. You generally can be quite careful about policies, plans, standards, routines, etc. And sometimes what to do here in terms of reducing functional stupidity, I sometimes play Beatles. And it's not then, as you may fear, all you need is love. It's let it be. Hear the words of wisdom, let it be, let it be. Because it's so tempting to just add stuff. Well, we have a problem here, then we have like diversity management or CSR or HRM or security procedures or compulsory training in whatever. And you just as a brilliant idea if you are into whatever. At the other end of the spectrum, you just are suffering from all this. And most organizations, large organizations, they are suffering more or less. So by then, play Beatles. Hear the words of wisdom, let it be, let it be. You can have the habit of asking critical questions during meetings and so on, if not done spontaneously. But I can say that now we all should ask one critical question about this. Or you can appoint people to becoming devil's advocate. Take turns in a management group or wherever. You have people that have the role as devil's advocate. Here is the T-shirt, or here is the hat. And then you bring them to the meetings, and then your role is actually to say something like, well, I all agree with you. We need to work with our vision. I think that's a fantastic idea. I really agree with you, chaps. But as a devil's advocate, I would say that most people will see this as corporate bullshit. Of course, I don't think like that at all. But as I now have this kind of hat or T-shirt which says that is something I think that I should be obliged to say then. You can say something without necessarily then getting spanked by people wanting you to agree with all the fantastically bright things that the CEO has come up with or whatever. You can also try to have senior people not just following hierarchies, but walk around. Reduce the number of formal meetings, less PowerPoint presentations, and then walk around. Dress as a customer, take some blue-collar workers or ordinary lecturers or whatever out on the pub, and after 3 pints of beer, you may hear something valuable. much more valuable sometimes than you may hear from your career-focused and yes-saying senior managers around you. So one can do things in order to improve the situation a bit, and one can also skip that. One can also read the book, The Stupidity Paradox, and perhaps give it as a Christmas gift to the boss or the HR manager or whoever one feels is in need of reading something like that. So with these humble words and a few words from our sponsor, there's no sponsor apart from Canfield University, but Sergey is advertising them. So I'm advertising the book, and there's this other one also on Time for Emptiness, on which I will give a talk in a couple of weeks, I think, or 3 weeks. So I will talk about this next lecture in the series on engaged scholarship. But with this, I rest my case, and then we have a few minutes then for questions or comments, or people that like to express their Weltschmerz. Weltschmerz, that's German, and means that the pain of the world will fall upon your meager shoulders. And sometimes I'm accused then of being a bit dark, gloomy, like Swedish detective stories. It's kind of dark and noir and so on. And it's no coincidence that my book covers, they tend to be black. I just noticed here, so I probably should bring that topic up with my shrink, if I had one. But one way of dealing with sometimes rather frustrating situations is to engage in intellectual work. And then when you write books like this, it can be a bit entertaining at times. And then you also work through some of the elements of irritation. So it has a therapeutical effect to work with these topics in this particular way. And sometimes I even feel that this is meaningful and contribute to reducing the functional stupidities of the world to some very small extent, but still. Yes.
Thank you very much, Mats. Yes, you are right. It is difficult to recognize some functional stupidity in ourselves. So it is the burden on our shoulders. However, it was encouraging, at least for me, to recognize some steps in reducing functional stupidity in myself personally, and in my organization. So I think currently in Cranfield we started cleanup at some functions. Thank you very much, Mats. It is interesting approach to the stupidity. We have many questions in the chat, so we can start questions and answer session. We need to limit this session to half an hour only. So we will organize this session in the way you raise your hand, and then you get the opportunity to ask the question directly. And while you are raising your hands, I will kickstart this session with some questions from the chat that we have so far. So I will try to combine a couple of questions in one. So would be the ambidextrous mode of leading organizations a response to the stupidity, to functional stupidity? And what's your perspective on functional stupidity in entrepreneurial organizations?
Well, I don't think we can generalize. I think that functional stupidity is everywhere, in all organizations, in all contexts. I do think that they can have different types of drivers and different types of outcomes. So in some cases you are so enthusiastic and you are working so hard and at quick speed and so on, so you become a bit bad in thoughtfulness because of speed. And sometimes in entrepreneurial organizations things should go quickly and so on. In other situations you may have all bureaucracy is the major source of all this. You may also have different countries, different sources. So in some countries you are very afraid of the boss, so you are very authoritarian, and therefore you don't think because you assume that you can't think outside the sphere of the boss's thinking. In other situations, you may be more inclined to agree with the people around you, your colleagues, and so on. So I do think that functional stupidity, different origins and different expressions of all this, but it tends to be some. Of course, it's very difficult to measure this, but in general, I think we need to be aware of this inclination, and then not only see it with other people. That's easier. Then you can see that other people, other professions, lawyers are stupid, or marketeers, or engineers, or academics, they are really stupid, and so on. But that may be the case. But the challenge is to see it in your own kind of setting, and particularly in a setting where everything sounds so good. Here we're into innovation and creativity and blah blah blah. But that doesn't prevent people from being perhaps too fond of particular ideas, which they can't question, or trying to innovate all the time because that's kind of fashionable and interesting and looks good, and so on, which could be much more sensible perhaps to just structure things and being a bit more repetitive in your approach, because it makes more sense and creates more value for those paying the wage you're paying for buying the products and so on.
Right, thank you very much. Before we move to the room, one more question from the chat. A couple of people ask your perspective on the state of things in armies. So, is it a picturesque example of functional stupidity, and whether it works well for the military environment?
Sorry, then was it the army or something else?
Yeah, armies in the defense. Right.
The defense forces. Yeah, and I think that's an interesting, because their stupidity, in one sense, it is very functional, because you need to obey. You can't start to ask for justification all the time. So in many situations, it should be discipline and order and obedience and a lot of other things. So in that sense, it may be more functional to stop thinking and do things that in one sense doesn't make sense, but it adds to the purpose. Then the problem with that kind of organization is that it often spills over. So people can't then move between the situation where you should shut up and just obey, and a lot of situations where you actually should think a bit further and realize now we have the time and we have the space, and I shouldn't be kind of responding. So I think it's an interesting example. But I talked with some people from the armed forces, and they said as sometimes so much is at stake, people's lives and so on. So there are situations where you go through your brief exercises and things like that. It should be as cleansed as possible in relationship to constraint and censorship and so on. So everybody should really give the honest opinion, what happened here and why didn't it function and so on. So in one sense, they probably have situations that are closer than to academic seminars, where the idea at least that it's the power of the good argument rather than the seniority or whatever that should be taken seriously. So we have situations where the good argument and minimization of functional stupidity should be an ideal. But in the armed forces, you have interesting combination of both. But I do think that it's quite common that the major orientation tend to spill over, and then you have a bit too much of this also in areas of military life, where one would hope perhaps people thinking a bit more independently and raising their voice if it's so is motivated.
Right, thank you very much. Yeah, there's a request if you can stop sharing the slide, so on the video, on the recording.
Sure.
We will be able. Now we are moving to the room, and my colleague Ibrat has raised his hand first. So Ibrat, can you please ask your question?
Yeah, sure. Mats, first of all, thank you very much for sharing this interesting idea. I was certainly moved by your book when I came across it about 3 years ago, and I was really tempted to give it as a Christmas present to to my boss back then. But then I thought maybe that would be a stupid thing in itself. My question is, the idea sounds quite almost like a commonsensical in some way, in that because we see it all around us, as you say. But on the other hand, I suppose the question it raises to me is, what does this mean for research? How do we research this? And maybe considering that there are a lot of kind of junior scholars in this call, what would you suggest to the young scholars wanting to research functional stupidity in the future?
Yeah, no, I think that's probably relevant for a lot of people. And sometimes whatever you are studying, then you can perhaps come across this phenomena. And sometimes when we do research, we have no particular intention to study this. And before we come up with a concept, we found the phenomena and pointed at something that we then can draw upon when we wrote the book and my other writings here, Stupidity Theology. So if we are aware of this, and I think we can be a bit sharper then in terms of making interesting interpretations in terms of what's happening here. How can I get some additional insights out of whatever I'm studying? So in that sense, I think it's a general good resource. If we are then pushing for this, I do think we need to have not only one person's views, and then you add up similar 30 accountants or 50 middle-level managers or whatever number of females at workplaces and so on. We need to have alternative views on events, processes, structures, and so on. And the more views we get, then we can see how various actors sometimes are constrained by their own limited outlook. We actually have one paper it's online, published in Organization Studies on willful ignorance, where we looked at a large information system, and everybody was thinking that they were doing their part, and this is part of a rational system. Everybody was happy with this. The only problem was that nobody could point at anybody using the data gathered and systematized and communicated for any valuable reason whatsoever. So if you have that broader view of what's happening in processes or across organizational units, or you just have the manager's view of the manager's decision-making or values or leadership or whatever, and then you observe this or you interview other people around, then you often see these discrepancies. And then you can move further and see, okay, how come that they have this understanding of the limited? And that's because they bought into a particular fantasy about the leadership or whatever. So through having more than one reference point and then checking the reference points, then I think that sometimes we can unpack this more carefully. And sometimes, of course, you can also do studies with people where you push things a bit further. And so what? What does this lead to? Do you know that? Often the problem is when we do studies. I here quote Churchill. This is not the end. It's not even the beginning of the end. It's perhaps the end of the beginning. That is how I see a lot of published papers, that they actually should. Why don't they push this further? Why do they stop with this? What does it mean? And then they sometimes in the qualified interview can see a lot of contradictions and confusions and another element. And if you can kind of trace them, then you can ask further questions. And sometimes it's quite obvious that here you have the functional stupidities, the comfortable, satisfying worldviews that people like to stick within. And if you can break out of that and you see how fragile and constraining that is, then you can directly point at examples of functional stupidity or whatever, confirmation bias, self-serving bias, and a lot of the cognitive peculiarities that we like to engage in. But a lot of studies, they simply assume that I go out there and interview people, I hear the truth or their experiences or good narrative, and I just assemble all this, and then I have an interesting contribution to make. No. In most cases, not.
Thank you very much. Mats Ibrat signals that he's satisfied with, with the response. Jim Bosch, you're the next.
Okay, thank you. For those of us in the United States, I got to wake up with all of this. So this is a nice way to wake up. I didn't even need coffee to get my juices flowing. I could just realize I'm stupider than I thought I was when I went to sleep last night. So thank you for this. Your term, reducing functional stupidity, on its face sounded stupid. And so then I started thinking about, we're either, I'm dealing with a very wise man who's got nested layers of stupidity, and I know I am, they can point that out. And there's also, it seems to me, almost the idiot with only half a cup of coffee in him. There's a 2x2 here, perhaps, of whatever intelligence is, and whatever the other side of stupidity is, and then functional and dysfunctional. So one might think you want to reduce dysfunctional stupidity, as opposed to reducing functional stupidity, although you might want to reduce functional stupidity, but then that gets into the functional underpinning of the whole argument. There's a cycle that runs through this for people that both have, I wish I had gray hair. I've got a gray beard. You've got gray hair. You know, where I
have a gray beard, so you still look like Gandalf a bit, so wise. Yeah.
Okay, I'll see you in 3 months. We'll do this again. But this gets to the land of double loop learning and wise fools and devil's advocates and the like, and so to me, tell me if my takeaway is appropriate. My big takeaway from this is, do not presume that you're intelligent. That if you think you're intelligent and you're going to celebrate your confident leadership, and you've got nice leadership followership cycles, and we've got some notion where every man and woman is now a leader, and that's all over the place these days, you are then prone to ignorance, born with blind spots. You're prone to overconfidence, if not hubris, and then you're prone to creating, to really mix our connections, little Eichmanns of little bureaucracies that are disconnected from reality. And so at the end of the day, I take your whole talk as a plea for humility. And if you just start with the presumption that you're living in a land that's veering toward dysfunctional stupidity, you're probably going to be all right. If you're living in a land where you think you're all that and you're smart as can be, and you've hired the best and the brightest, and you're on your way to oblivion. So is that at the fundamental root of it? Is that kind of the essence of it? Is this a call for humility?
Yeah. And I think that's a good way. And of course, we have a lot of examples. We're extremely, the Kennedy administration, the best and the brightest. Very intelligent people, very well educated, and they were responsible for escalation of the Vietnam War, the invasion of the Bay of Pigs, and did a lot of other things as well. The Holocaust group, the Wannsee conference, when the Germans they decided on the final solution, they were extremely well educated people, many with a doctor's degree and so on. And we assume normally that organizations are rational, and everything we do as management scholars, we add then policies and strategies and leadership recipes and CSR and knowledge management and you name it. And we assume that all this leads to more and more rational and well-functioning organizations. The other side of this is that not necessarily. So we should assume that a lot of things we are doing is not as clever or rational as we may believe. And even in academia, in particular, perhaps in contemporary academia. Anders Spicer once said that contemporary academia is a hothouse of functional stupidity. And when you approach journals, sometimes, this is our kind of criteria, it's the templates, the formula, and a lot of people assume that this is the only way to do it. Gap spotting, find and fill the gap, and position yourself in the literature and so on. And if you try to argue something else, then people temporarily, they agree totally with all this, and then they follow the template. So I would say that we need to consider this a lot of the time in a lot of different contexts. And if we have one argument here, one hope is that this will lead to a bit more of moral inclination to not just adapt, but occasionally speak up a bit more. And if we assume that functional stupidity is something that is characterizing a lot of organizations and a lot of professions and ourselves, okay, then we have some distance to rather problematic inclinations, and we can do things a bit better on the margin. Normally I advise people to pick your battles, but make sure that you not end your life without having ever fought any battles. And if people take that on board, I think that occasionally they run into problems, but they also do something that's a bit more meaningful and good.
I like that. That seems like that comment should be on a mug or something, or a poster. You could sell that. Don't end your life.
But one could institutionalize this. One could have that in appraisal talks. Okay, what have you contributed? Blah 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 blah. Have you picked any battles? And of course, if it's a really stupid battle because you're the only one that can see this, here's a battle to be fought, or it's too many without carefully considerations, what is really the problem, what can be accomplished, and so on. But I can say this is like the point at an appraisal talk. Contribution to academic metrics, contribution to productive dissensus at workplaces.
Thank you very much. We still have time for a couple of more questions. I see Richmond has his hand up. Richmond, can you please unmute yourself and
yes. Yeah, very interesting presentation. It's quite amazing. But I wanted to find out if you're a practitioner in an organization which is surrounded by functional stupidity, and all of you don't recognize that your functional is stupid, but yet it's not a conducive environment for the growth of the organization. How do you correct the situation to improve the organization for the better? How do you recognize that this is totally functional stupid, the entire organization? How do we come to that? And possibly, if picking maybe a consultant as one of a remedy to correct the situation, how do you also come to that realization?
Right.
Well, I mentioned a couple of techniques before. You could ask perhaps newcomers, talk with people, meet people from other industries, other occupations, and then read stuff, or start to institutionalize. I mean, you can have reading groups or whatever. But so you can do a lot of things here. But if it's too problematic, it's too repressive, and the space is very limited, then one should leave. I think as quickly as possible, if one can't do that much about it. But normally you start by asking some people you have good relationship with, isn't this problematic? Why are we doing this, and so on? And if people agree, then you may have some self-confidence to check so that you are not yourself very much locked into a particular ideal or mindset. And then you cautiously perhaps start to raise issues and then see what will happen. So sometimes perhaps people say, well, I thought about that. That's really a good idea. You get a lot of support. And of course, in other cases, one just realized that this is too dangerous, too problematic. So then one make a mild retreat. But one step is always to get some insight yourself, and then either try to communicate to people around and see if something can be raised on a broader level, or you can try with various kind of techniques. So I was in contact with a Dutch company, and they tried to develop a system. I don't know what happened there, but that meant that everybody was asked them to name a number of issues they found problematic anonymously. And they should have a technical system so people could vote for the candidates for change or for just extinction. Stop doing this. And then there were kind of voting systems, so it should end with 5 or 10 suggestions which people have voted for getting rid of or drastically changing or whatever, and then put that list to top management, and one can say that here are 10 issues Now you choose 5 and do something radically about them. So sometimes you can consider different types of techniques or procedures then for doing this in such a way so that people are not too vulnerable. Then what's happening, you never know, but this could be worth an effort.
Quite interesting.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Richmond. I think it's time to finish. May I ask you the very final question on the call? So historically, universities are offsprings or spin-outs from monasteries, and monasteries are institutions initiated by the church. So I need to be careful. I will talk about my religion. So Orthodox Christianity Church, it's an old organization, and arguably functional stupidity works well for that organization. They sustain their existence for at least a couple of thousand years. So coming back to the origins of universities, would you think that we need to retain functional stupidity in universities to promote longevity of our existence, or should we embrace more dysfunctional reflexivity as a function of epistemic process?
Yeah, no, I actually do think that we should try to do something radical. Now we are into the massification industry. And with massification, bureaucracy follows. We have what I call consumocracy. Consumocracy. It's a combination of consumer orientation and then bureaucracy. And that is the combination of the bad of two worlds. I don't think that universities should be consumer oriented. I like to quote Churchill, actually. So I'm not here. I sometimes tell students, I'm not here to optimize student satisfaction. I'm here. Only thing I can offer you is blood, sweat, tear, and well, blood, sweat, tear, whatever, tears, and so on. And then, of course, the idea is that they should struggle, be intellectually challenged. They learn and then they qualify, but that's a bit different than you are consumer oriented. So I do think that we need really to think, what are we doing? What are we accomplishing? Can we do things in much better ways? And we surely can. I do think that contemporary higher education is really going downhill, and it's in many ways a catastrophe. If 40% spend 3 or 4 years in higher education without intellectually developing, I think that's really a sign of things being quite bad.
Thank you very much. That's a clear message for us to depart from functional stupidity in higher education. Thank you very much, Mats, for your talk. Thank you very much for the answers to our question. That was really thought-provoking and enlightening event for all of us.